I'm about to show you why a slam dunk death penalty case is legally dead on arrival. So the state of Utah wants to execute Tyler Robinson, but under Supreme Court law, the government must prove the chain of custody. The original planning note was destroyed. The shooting clothes never recovered. The crime scene was paved over 2 days later. And the bullet that killed Charlie Kirk, the ATF says in their own report that they cannot identify it to the rifle. That is not beyond a reasonable doubt. That is, we have no idea. And I'm going to prove it to you line by line from the official record. And I want to start by saying something that I think is really important here before we get into any of this. I'm not here to tell you who killed Charlie Kirk, okay? I'm not going to pretend that I know. I am not Candace Owens, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I've figured out what the government hasn't, okay? That is not what this is. What I am going to do is something that I think is actually much more important that hasn't been done yet. I'm going to show you point by point, fact by fact, source document by source document that the investigation into Charlie Kirk's assassination did not meet the legal standard that our own justice system requires. Not my standard, the government's own standard. I competed in state and debate, state level cross-examination debate. And the one thing that my coach always drilled into me was this: you do not win by ignoring the things that don't fit your argument. You win by addressing them honestly and letting the evidence speak for itself. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at what the evidence actually shows, and we're going to look at what it doesn't show. We're going to note the things that are just plain weird and don't have clean explanations, and we're going to let you decide what it all means. Because here's what I believe. A society that demands rigorous investigation is a society that gets better government. And right now, I don't think we're demanding enough. So let's get into it. Now, before we can talk about what went wrong, we need to really establish what right looks like, okay? The government called this a slam dunk, right? The FBI Director Kash Patel used those exact words. So let's talk about what a slam dunk actually requires legally, not just in terms of like public opinion. There are 3 Supreme Court cases that establish the bedrock standard for every prosecution in America. Brady versus Maryland, 1963. The prosecution must disclose all exculpatory evidence to the defense. All of it. Not the parts that help them, all of it. Withholding is a constitutional violation regardless of intent. In Giglio versus United States in 1972, any deal, any immunity, any benefit given to a witness must be disclosed to the defense. The jury has a right to know about anything that affects a witness's credibility. Now, in Daubert versus Merrill Dow in 1993, scientific evidence must meet reliability standards before it can be admitted. Judges act as gatekeepers. You cannot present any forensic claim and call it science. Those 3 cases create a checklist. Okay, so we're going to run this investigation through that checklist. So the prosecution's case against Tyler Robinson fails 3 fundamental tests that every capital prosecution must pass. The first one is the evidentiary test. The physical evidence doesn't actually link Robinson to the murder. Secondly, the procedural test. The investigation was rushed, it was incomplete, and it was compromised. Third, the institutional test. The institutions involved prioritized closing this case over solving it. This is not about Robinson's guilt or innocence. It's about whether the government has met its constitutional burden before seeking to execute a citizen. And what are the 3 pillars of a constitutionally sound prosecution? What it requires, basically, and what's missing here. This exculpatory disclosure. So all evidence favorable to the defense must be disclosed. Complete transparency about its weaknesses. The ballistics are inconclusive. The forensic nexus investigation was shut down, and we'll go into this in a minute. The witness's credibility. All deals, immunity must be disclosed. Full accounting of what the witnesses received, such as Twiggs immunity, again, we'll go into this, is unexplained. And forensic reliability, meaning scientific evidence must meet the reliability of standards called chain of custody through independent verification. Well, the chain breaks here. The primary evidence was destroyed, things were paved over, and this prosecution that fails any one of these pillars should not proceed to trial. This case fails all three. So let me give you two comparison cases, because this is what an actual slam dunk looks like, and you'll see it looks very different. The BTK killer, so his name was Dennis Rader. In 2005, the BTK killed 10 people over 30 years. Now, when they finally caught him, the prosecution had confirmed DNA from multiple crime scenes, all matching Rader. His own daughter's DNA used to confirm a familial match independently. Physical evidence from every single crime scene with an unbroken documented chain of custody. His own written communications as primary evidence, okay, the originals, not photographs of the originals, a full confession corroborated by physical evidence at every single point independently. Every piece of evidence confirms the next piece independently. And nothing was inconclusive, nothing relied on one single source. This is what a slam dunk looks like. There's also the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, in 2020. So investigators spent decades building this case correctly rather than just rushing to one conclusion to close it. And when they finally discharged DeAngelo, they had genealogical DNA matching through a public database. They had DNA from crime scenes confirming the match independently, physical surveillance corroborating the identification, and a guilty plea to 13 murders because the evidence was so complete. There was no viable defense here. So the investigation took 40 years to complete properly. Nobody called it a slam dunk until it actually was one. So here's the point that these two cases make. In both of them, the investigators built the case completely before making the arrest. They didn't arrest someone and then build the case around that arrest. They built the case, then they made the arrest. Keep that distinction in mind as we go through what happened here. So in any murder by a firearm, the most important physical evidence is the link between the weapon and the wound. Now, can you prove this gun fired the bullet that killed this person? In this case, the answer, according to the government's own filings, is not really. The ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, analyzed this bullet recovered from Charlie Kirk's body. And here's what they found. In their own words, from their own court filings, the ATF was unable to identify the bullet recovered at autopsy to the rifle allegedly tied to Robinson. This is not my characterization. This is from the ATF's own report cited in a defense court filing. In a death penalty case, inconclusive means the prosecution cannot prove the specific weapon fired the fatal shot, right? Inconclusive in forensic terms means there wasn't enough identifiable characteristics on the bullet fragment to make a definitive determination. Either way, it means we can't confirm. But here is the legal problem with that explanation in a capital murder case, because it's a big one. The prosecution is seeking the death penalty. They want to execute Tyler Robinson, and the primary physical link between the weapon and the fatal wound, the thing that literally proves this specific gun fired the bullet that killed Charlie Kirk, cannot be confirmed by the government's own forensic agency. In the BTK, for example, the DNA was confirmed. In the Golden State Killer, the DNA was confirmed. In both cases, the physical evidence was airtight before they filed any charges. So here, that link is unconfirmed, and the death penalty is on the table. So there's one more thing worth noting about the ballistics, okay? The prosecution violated a court-ordered gag order by discussing the inconclusive ballistics reports publicly with Fox News and TMZ before the defense had fully been informed. That is documented. The judge was made aware of it. The defense is seeking sanctions, including removal of the death penalty, as a consequence. So not only is the primary forensic link unconfirmed, the prosecution then violated a court order in how they handled that fact publicly. This is not a conspiracy, guys. This is what the court record says. The chain of custody is one of the most fundamental concepts in criminal law. It means, can you document where every single piece of evidence has been from the moment it was collected to the moment that it is presented in court? Can you prove nobody tampered with it? Can you prove it is the same item collected at the scene? If the chain breaks, meaning if the evidence can be thrown out. So if it's thrown out in a capital case, the whole case can literally collapse. So before we look at the chain of custody and where it's clearly collapsed in this, there's one more important thing. Why did they pave over where Charlie Kirk was shot? Why was it a paving emergency? Utah Valley University repaved the parking lot within days of the shooting. Now, in any homicide, I don't know about you guys, investigation, the crime scene is literally preserved for months. By paving it, they probably physically destroyed everything. Potential blood spatter analysis, tire tracks, or footprints of the alleged shooter. Of him fleeing. It could have destroyed potential bullet fragments or shell casings that may have been missed. Also, gunshot residue, particles that fell to the ground, or even explosives, right? Paving over a federal assassination crime scene is not only incompetence, it is willful destruction of physical evidence that breaks the chain of custody at its very foundation. The university has never provided a legally sufficient reason for that emergency. So now let's look at where the chain of custody has documented problems, okay, in this case. The prosecution's primary evidence of premeditation is a note that was allegedly left by Robinson under a keyboard for his partner to find. That note says, "I had the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and I'm going to take it." That note no longer exists. The original document was inadvertently destroyed. What exists is a photograph of the note. Okay. In a court, a photograph of a document is not the same thing as the document itself. Okay. The defense can challenge whether or not the photograph accurately represents the original. They can challenge when it was taken, by whom, and under what conditions and circumstances. They can challenge whether or not the note existed at all in the form presented. In the BTK murder, for example, the original communications were preserved. In the Golden State Killer, the original DNA samples were preserved. Here, the single most important piece of evidence of premeditation is a photograph of something that no longer exists. The murder weapon, a .30-06 Mauser bolt action rifle approximately 43 inches long, was not found on Robinson when he was arrested. It was found in a wooded area near campus. Robinson's own text described trying to retrieve it and being unable to because of police presence. We'll get into that later. But here is the documented chain of custody question. Who found the rifle? When exactly? Where were the dog sniffers? And what is the complete documented record of its handling from discovery to the evidence room? Because that's not detailed. In a capital case, that documentation should be airtight and publicly available, and it's not. Robinson allegedly changed clothes at least twice on the day of the shooting. He arrived in casual clothing, changing into dark clothing before the shooting, and apparently changing back before turning himself in. The clothing worn during the assassination, which would contain gunshot residue, has never been publicly confirmed as recovered. Where is that clothing? Was it tested? What did the test show? These questions have never been publicly answered. The texts have no timestamps. This is confirmed in court documents, okay? The text messages that form the backbone of the whole confession evidence, right, that Robinson allegedly sent text to his partner after the shooting were produced without timestamps. I can't make this stuff up. The defense has confirmed this. Without timestamps, you cannot independently verify the sequence of events. You cannot confirm when messages were sent relative to the shooting. Now, in a capital case, that is a significant evidentiary gap. A strong prosecution has clean witnesses, witnesses whose credibility is impeachable, witnesses whose testimony is corroborated by physical evidence independently. This case has witness problems, big time, okay? Lance Twiggs, the primary witness, received immunity. Lance Twiggs is Robinson's romantic partner. Twiggs found the planning note. Twiggs received the post-shooting confession text. Twiggs is expected to be the prosecution's primary witness. But before giving a sworn statement, Twiggs was granted limited immunity by prosecutors. Immunity is granted when a witness has personal criminal exposure, meaning that they could be charged with a crime if they testify without protection. But you don't give immunity to somebody who simply received a text message. You give immunity to somebody who did something that could constitute a crime. Okay? Under Giglio versus United States, a Supreme Court case that we talked about earlier, the prosecution must fully disclose a basis for that immunity to the defense and ultimately to the jury. And the jury has a right to know what Twiggs was protected from and why. The basis for Twiggs' immunity has never been explained. Okay, why did Twiggs do the required legal protection? Why did he need that to testify? This is a legitimate question and it hasn't been answered. So let's get into the next part about the witnesses. There was a witness 20 feet away that wasn't called. Zachariah Qureshi was standing about 20 feet away from Charlie Kirk when the shot was fired. He was in line to ask Kirk a question. He was the second person that was detained by investigators as a person of interest. He was tracked to his home, he was interrogated, and released. A person 20 feet from the victim at the moment of the shot is potentially the most valuable eyewitness to the physical facts of the shooting that exists outside of basic video footage, right? So as far as the public record shows, Qureshi has never been listed as a prosecution witness. His witness statement has never publicly been incorporated into the prosecution's evidence. Why not? Multiple people on social media have claimed to have been in the direct line of sight between the Low C Center rooftop and Kirk's position at the time of the shooting. At least one individual posted publicly claiming investigators showed no interest in speaking with them. In a case where the FBI received 7,000 tips and conducted over 200 interviews, the failure to seek out geometrically positioned eyewitnesses, if true, is a material investigative gap. Kirk's official TPUSA TikTok account posted a video in the seconds before he was shot, showing the event and panning towards the Low C Center rooftop. Someone operated that camera. That person was filming in the direction of the alleged shooter's position moments before the shot. Who was that person? Were they interviewed? What did they see? Their account has never been publicly documented. I want to spend some time on the next one because I think it's really one of the most important and the least examined parts of this entire case. So George Zinn is a 71-year-old man who was present at the Kirk shooting. Within about 2 minutes of the shot being fired, he approached a police officer and repeatedly shouted, "I shot him, now shoot me." When asked where the gun was, he said, "I'm not going to tell you where it is." He was taken into custody. He later admitted his statements were deliberate and said that his specific intent was to draw attention away from the real shooter and to hinder law enforcement during the critical escape window. And he was charged with obstruction. He pleaded guilty, and now he has 20 years. So here are the documented facts about George Zinn that raise some really legitimate questions about whether the investigation was thorough enough, and it gets weird. So in 2013, following the Boston Marathon bombing, Zinn sent an email to Salt Lake City Marathon organizers asking if they needed anyone to help place bombs near the finish line. He was charged with making a terroristic threat a second-degree felony. He pleaded guilty to a reduced misdemeanor, and he received probation. He has a criminal record spanning from 1989 basically to 2025, decades of arrests at political events across Utah. The Salt Lake County District Attorney described him as somebody who appeared at almost every political event that you can think of. He has documented connections to prominent figures in Utah's Republican political establishment. And when authorities searched his phone, they found over 20 graphic child sexual abuse images of children 5 to 12 with active text threads discussing assault on kids. Now, I'm not telling you what any of this means because I genuinely don't know. But here's what I am telling you. This man admitted on the record that he deliberately ran interference to help a killer escape. He knew within 120 seconds of a single gunshot and a crowd of 3,000 people that he needed to create a diversion. The official response was to charge him with obstruction, describe him as a gadfly, and then close it entirely. Now, his pre-September 10th communications were never publicly examined. His connections to the Republican establishment were never publicly explored. How he knew to act within 120 seconds has also never been explained. But the official statement from the Utah County Sheriff was, at this time, there is no information that George Zinn actually colluded with the shooter. Note the specific language, okay? No information of collusion. Not collusion was ruled out, not we investigated and found no connection, no information. That is a very different statement, okay? In a case being prosecuted as a capital murder slam dunk, The documented background of the one person who admitted deliberate obstruction of justice at the scene deserves more than a single sentence and a misdemeanor plea, right? So I think he got 20 years now, but Robinson allegedly also arrived on the campus at approximately 8:07 to 8:29. The shot was fired at 12:23 p.m. That is approximately 4 hours on campus before the assassination. The affidavit covers the main moments: arrival, the rooftop at 11:41, the shot at 12:23, the approximate 3 hours in between what Robinson was doing on campus from 8:30 a.m. to 11:51 have not been documented. Was he surveilling the event? Was he waiting somewhere? Was he observed by anyone? Did he interact with anyone? Was there any camera that picked him up or tracked his movements during these hours? If surveillance tracked his movements onto the campus through a stairwell up to the roof, as the affidavit states, then surely the 3 hours before he reached the roof should also be documented on that same surveillance system, right? Why has this period never been publicly accounted for? In a strong prosecution, the timeline is super complete. Like, it's iron. It's every movement's documented, every location is confirmed, and the gaps are explained in detail. This gap has not been examined nor explained, and I want to address this honestly because I know it is one of the biggest questions that people have. Okay, so on the next one, I want to be clear here. I'm not here to tell you that anybody was involved in this, and I'm not here to tell you Israel was involved in Charlie Kirk's death. I don't know that. Nobody in the public sphere knows that. What I'm going to do is tell you what is actually documented, okay? Because ignoring it doesn't serve anyone either, and pretending it doesn't exist doesn't make the questions just randomly go away. So here is the documented record. In the months before his assassination, Charlie Kirk's relationship with pro-Israel donor base became strained. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented in his own words. Kirk sent a private letter to Benjamin Netanyahu describing what he called a five-alarm fire over Israel's public relations strategy. He told Netanyahu that support for Israel was slipping away, particularly among young Americans, and he concluded the letter by encouraging Netanyahu to call him at his private number. Separately, and this is confirmed as authentic, Kirk wrote in a WhatsApp group that included Jewish associates, "I cannot and will not be bullied like this." He said the pressure from donors left him no choice but to leave the pro-Israel cause. He also wrote that his Jewish donors were playing into all the stereotypes. Okay, Tucker Carlson, who knew Charlie Kirk personally, stated publicly that Kirk told him backstage that he felt Netanyahu was a destructive force and was appalled by what was happening in Gaza and was resentful that he believed Netanyahu was using the United States to prosecute his wars. Tucker Carlson also said that Kirk told him regarding Epstein's alleged intelligence connections, go all the way, go max, tell it all, basically. So Megyn Kelly separately confirmed that Kirk had expressed frustration around donor pressure over his Israel positions. Now here's where it gets genuinely unusual. Benjamin Netanyahu was one of the first world leaders to publicly respond after Kirk's death, describing him as a lion-hearted friend of Israel. And then, before any investigation had implicated anyone, before any law enforcement agency had suggested a foreign connection, before any official had raised Israel as a suspect, Netanyahu posted a preemptive video denial of Israeli involvement. Heads of state don't typically post preemptive video denials in response to social media speculation beforehand. The speed and specificity of that response is worth noting. Now, I'm not connecting these dots for you. I'm just telling you they exist. And what I can tell you within documented certainty is this. The National Counterterrorism Center that was headed by a Trump appointee was actively investigating potential foreign connections to Kirk's assassination. That investigation was shut down before it was complete. The stated reason was that the case was a slam dunk lone actor situation. Have we heard this before? When the full picture of Charlie Kirk's relationship with his pro-Israel donors and with the Israeli government was ever fully investigated as a potential motive context, based on the public record, the answer appears to be no. Why? That's a legitimate question, and it deserves a legitimate answer, but unfortunately we haven't gotten one. So this next section is about something that deserves a little bit more attention than it has received. But when a person is assassinated, when someone is murdered in public in front of thousands of people, the people closest to them typically want answers. They push for investigation, they demand accountability, transparency, get it all out. They want to know. They ask very hard questions. And I want to walk you through what Turning Point USA, the organization that Charlie Kirk himself founded, devoted his life to, actually did in the weeks after his death, because it is genuinely unusual. 8 days after Kirk's assassination, his wife, Erica Kirk, was appointed CEO and board chair of TPUSA. 8 days. For a $95 million organization with no known prior organizational leadership experience. Within that same first week, TPUSA spokesman Andrew Colvett announced 54,000 inquiries for new campus chapters and called it, and I'm quoting directly, truly incredible. The organization publicly framed the assassination of their founder as a growth opportunity within days of his murder. Over the following months, more than 60 employees were fired in what staff described as a purge. A PR manager of 4.5 years was fired after an Uber driver said that she had expressed skepticism about the official narrative. And she stated publicly, "I have a gut feeling that I was terminated because I am questioning the narrative of what happened to my role model." Other employees reportedly discussed their doubts privately amongst themselves, afraid to raise questions internally. So instead of demanding an independent forensic investigation, instead of pressing the FBI for transparency on the ballistics, and instead of calling for public accountability from the UVU police chief who promised security and didn't deliver it, and instead of pushing for the NCTC's foreign nexus investigation to continue, TPUSA sent cease and desist letters to people online who were asking questions. Now, I'm not saying Erica Kirk's a bad person. I'm not saying she is responsible for anything, but monetizing your husband's murder is indeed a strange way of handling your grief. The institutional outroar when anyone questioned Erica's behavior is also very strange. What I'm saying is this: the organization that Charlie Kirk built, he gave his life to, has shown more interest in suppressing questions about his death than in answering them. And that's worth asking about Erica Kirk. Also, she publicly forgave Tyler Robinson very quickly after the assassination. Again, grief is personal and I'm not judging that, but combined with the organizational behavior and the rapid leadership transition, the employee firings, and the absence of any independent investigation demand, it's a pattern worth noting, okay? A grieving organization that genuinely wanted answers would look different from this. This next section is important because it speaks directly to why so many people across the political spectrum have found it really hard to trust the official narrative. And I want to be fair here, distrust of the institutions is not the same as institutions being corrupt. But distrust has to be earned back, and these are the specific things that created it. Within hours of the shooting, FBI Director Kash Patel announced on social media, "The subject for a horrific shooting today that took the life of Charlie Kirk is now in custody." That was wrong. 2 innocent people had been detained and released. Robinson wasn't arrested for another 33 hours. Patel later said, "Could I have worded it a little better in the heat of the moment? Sure." In any major investigation, a false announcement of custody is not like a minor wording issue. It literally contaminates the whole public record and potentially tips off actual suspects, and it permanently damages the credibility of every subsequent official statement. This is Investigation 101. The court then issued a gag order specifically to protect the integrity of the case. The prosecution then spoke to Fox News, TMZ, and other outlets about the ballistics evidence, literally the single most sensitive piece of forensic evidence in the case, in violation of that very order. The defense is now seeking to remove the death penalty as a sanction for this violation. But a prosecution that violates its own court-ordered gag order on the most sensitive evidence in a capital case, it's not a prosecution operating with discipline and professionalism at all. A deputy prosecutor's 18-year-old child was in the crowd when Kirk was shot. This child texted their parent, the prosecuting attorney, from the scene during the chaos. The defense argues this personal connection caused a rush to seek the death penalty driven by emotional reaction rather than evidentiary readiness. And the fact that the Utah County Attorney's Office didn't recuse itself and that no external oversight demanded its failure of legal ethics is not just a bad look, it literally fundamentally poisons the whole procedural well here. Okay, at the conference announcing Robinson's arrest, FBI Director Kash Patel closed his remarks with, "Rest now, brother. We have the watch, and I'll see you in Valhalla." Here are simply the facts. Kash Patel was raised Hindu. Charlie Kirk was a devout Christian. Neither man served in the military, right? And under actual Norse mythology being invoked here, Valhalla is specifically reserved for warriors who die in combat. A murder victim does not qualify under the mythology's own rules. Okay, so under these pretenses, if they were following mythology, Charlie Kirk would have gone to a place called Hel, and that doesn't mean what you think it is, it's just simply a different place. That warrior who died in the line of combat, who wasn't murdered, wouldn't go to Valhalla, right? He was murdered, so he wouldn't go to Valhalla. Some people believe this was coded language. I'm not making that claim. But what I can tell you is that in 2022, the Buffalo grocery store mass shooter ended his manifesto with the phrase, "I hope to see you in Valhalla." The neo-Nazi Atomwaffen Division members responded to Patel's statement publicly with, "This press conference is amazing." I'm not connecting those dots for you. I'm simply telling you they exist. And asking, at a federal press conference about a political assassination, was that the right choice of words? And why couldn't the FBI explain what it meant when reporters asked? A press conference statement that requires explanation and generates celebration from neo-Nazi channels is a communication failure, period, end of story. Okay, this section matters because it speaks directly to whether the investigation was allowed to be complete. Joe Kent was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Okay, he is a former Green Beret with 11 combat deployments. He's a Trump appointee. He stated publicly on the record that his office was actively investigating potential foreign connections to Kirk's assassination and was told to stop before that investigation was complete. We were then told, and I quote, "Hey, you guys need to stop. You can't work on this anymore," Kent said. He stated there was more work for us to do on the potential of a foreign nexus, and we were blocked from doing that. The FBI's stated reason for shutting it down, the case was a slam dunk and should be handled by Utah state authorities. This conflict escalated to a White House meeting involving Kent, FBI's Director Patel, Vice President J.D. Vance. Kent subsequently resigned from his position. Now, I'm not telling you what the foreign nexus investigation would have found because I don't know. Nobody outside that room probably knows. But what I'm telling you is this. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center, appointed by the same administration prosecuting this case, publicly stated that leaders were cut off before they were fully investigated. He found this significant enough to resign over. Okay, in a complete investigation, you run every lead to the ground. You don't stop because you think you already have a slam dunk, because you have your man. You stop when there is nothing left to investigate. By Kent's own account, there was still work to do, and that work was not done. The Daily Caller News Foundation filed a public records request with Utah Valley University, specifically seeking UVU Police Chief Jeff Long's communications related to the Kirk assassination. They received 112 pages of documents. Large portions were blacked out. Additional records were withheld entirely. Here's what was confirmed in those records. Brian Harpel, the head of Kirk's private security, documented a text exchange with Chief Long in which Harpel specifically flagged the risk of rooftop access. Long responded, "I've got you covered." But the rooftops were not covered. Charlie Kirk was supposedly shot from a rooftop 2 minutes into the event. Chief Long's communications surrounding that promise and its failure are now being withheld under legal exemptions. Utah Republican State Representative Ryan Wilcox called the security situation a complete disaster. The university also denied a separate records request from Fox 13 seeking the security plan for the event. Now, I want to be fair here. There are legitimate legal reasons to withhold these kind of records during an active prosecution. I understand that. But here is the question worth asking. Incompetence is not a classified matter. Okay? If the security failure was simply a miscommunication or a shoddy job, if it was just a mistake, there is no legal reason to withhold those. The fact that they are being withheld suggests that either they're relevant to the prosecution, in which case the defense should have them, or they reveal something about the security failure that someone does not want publicly examined. Either way, the public deserves to know what happened on that rooftop and why the promise that was made to Kirk's security team was not kept. The defense in this case has received more than 600,000 files in the discovery. This case involves one shooter, one victim, supposedly one shooter, one victim, one shot, and the defense has 600,000 files with more still coming. One of the defense's forensic experts stated she would need months just to review the materials. Two federal agencies, the ATF and the FBI, could not produce complete discovery in time for the preliminary hearing. The defense wrote in a court filing, "Discovery in this case is incomplete, voluminous, and the processing of it is complex." Now, the prosecution says this reflects the thoroughness of their investigation. But 600,000 files of incomplete discovery, 9 months after the arrest in a case that the prosecution calls a slam dunk, doesn't look like a case that was ready to be filed as a capital murder charge within 6 days of the shooting. It just doesn't. A slam dunk has its evidence ready. It doesn't need 9 months of incomplete discovery to support the charges it filed in less than a week. Okay. Now, I'm not a forensic linguist, and I'm not presenting this as definitive claim. I am presenting it as something worth noting because it is genuinely unusual. Tyler Robinson's documented, authentic communication style with his Discord messages, his social media, his texts with friends is consistent with a 22-year-old deeply embedded in internet culture. Okay. He texted his Wordle score to a friend at 11:28 a.m., 55 minutes before allegedly firing the shot. He used internet meme language. He described his own engraved bullet casings as mostly a big meme. Now, if you read some of the confession text language, I think they've already swept that spot. There's a squad car parked right behind it. I had planned to grab my rifle from my drop point. Some hate cannot be negotiated out. Swept? Squad car instead of police drop point? These are not words that a 22-year-old electrical apprentice from St. George, Utah typically uses in casual communication. Swept is law enforcement and military terminology for a systematic area search. Squad car is older police procedural language, and somebody his age and his background typically would say cop car, right? Drop point is operational planning terminology. And then some hate cannot be negotiated out. This is composed, philosophically framed language from somebody whose minutes earlier was texting a word puzzle score? Does a 22-year-old electrical apprentice say things like this and text his Wordle score to a friend minutes before his assassination, also express himself in operational military language immediately after? I don't know, but the evidence doesn't show that. What I'm telling you is that a forensic linguist expert who testified in court whether these texts were authored by the person claiming to have written them would find this inconsistency worth examining. And as far as the public record shows, neither the prosecution nor the defense has retained a forensic linguist. Given that confession, texts are the backbone of this case, and that absence is worth noting. So let me be very clear about what I am saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying Tyler Robinson is innocent or guilty, and I'm not saying there was a conspiracy. I'm not saying I know who killed Charlie Kirk or why. What I am saying is documented, sourced, and in the public record. The primarily ballistic link between the weapon and the wound is unconfirmed by the government's own forensic agency. The primary premeditation evidence is a photograph of a document that no longer exists. Under a federal rule of evidence, 1002, the best evidence rule, To prove the content of a writing, the original is required unless it's lost or destroyed in good faith. Now, the prosecution destroyed the original note. The burden is now on them to prove that it was destroyed in good faith, not on you to prove it was faked. They have never explained why the original was destroyed. And in a death penalty case, destroying the sole physical proof of premeditation is kind of important and a massive due process violation. It's not just a weird thing. The primary witness required immunity before testifying, and the basis for that immunity has never been publicly explained. The text messages that form the backbone of that confession have no timestamps. Okay? The prosecution violated a court-ordered gag order on the most sensitive evidence in the case. The prosecution's office has a personal emotional stake in the outcome. Charlie Kirk's own documented words show that he was experiencing significant private pressure over his public positions on Israel in the weeks before his death, and a parallel investigation into potential foreign nexus was shut down before it was completed. The organization Kirk founded has shown more interest in suppressing questions about his death than in demanding answers. The most anomalous person at the scene, a man who admitted to deliberate obstruction of justice, has a documented history of inserting himself into political violence events, was minimized, and his background never publicly examined. The security failure that allowed the shooting to occur has produced withheld documents and no public accountability. And there are 600,000 files of incomplete discovery in a case that was filed as a capital murder charge within 6 days of the shooting. In a capital case, the prosecution must file a formal notice of aggravating circumstances to seek the death penalty. Okay? The prosecution's official filed motive is incredibly thin. It's essentially Robinson hated Kirk. They never filed a formal evidentiary basis for why this 22-year-old supposedly snapped outside of texts that don't have timestamps without a demonstrable documented motive backed by a third-party witness. The procedural burden for seeking the death penalty hasn't been met at all. Okay? Now, the prosecution wants you to look at the DNA on the gun, and I'm not going to do that because DNA on a gun doesn't prove who pulled the trigger, and more importantly, it doesn't fix the chain of custody problems and all the other stuff. You cannot use DNA on a rifle to fix the fact that the rifle was found in the woods by persons unknown, without drug dogs, without sniffer dogs. The crime scene was paved over. The primary note was destroyed. The texts have no timestamps. The government's job is to prove the entire chain of custody. DNA is just one single little link in that chain. And a chain with 10 broken links doesn't become unbroken just because one link appears to be very shiny. Okay, the burden of proof rests on them to show us where that rifle was every second, from the rooftop to the evidence locker. And they can't. But that's the legal standard, okay? That is the only standard that matters. That's the record. This is not my interpretation here, okay? And here's why this matters beyond just a specific case. The American criminal justice system operates on a principle that is foundational to everything that we believe about fairness and liberty. The government must prove its case completely beyond reasonable doubt before it can take a citizen's life or liberty. That standard was not invented to protect guilty people. It was invented because we learned through centuries of hard experience what happens when governments decide they already know the answer and they build the case backward from the conclusion. Okay? And we are watching that happen in real time, folks. And the question is not whether Tyler Robinson is guilty. The question is whether we are going to hold our institutions to the standard that they set for themselves. Because here's the truth. If the investigation was this incomplete, in a case this high profile, with this much media attention and this many resources and this much political pressure to get it right, what does a low profile case look like? What does justice look like for people who don't have millions of followers and public reach? I don't know if we will ever have complete answers in this case. I genuinely don't. I hope so. But what I know is that the documented record raises questions that a thorough investigation should have answered before a death penalty charge was filed. We get to demand better, not because we think we know what happened, but because we know what a proper investigation looks like And we know this wasn't it. Okay? If you found this valuable, please share it, not because you believe any specific theory, but because it's true and because you believe in rigorous investigation, honest accountability, and in a justice system that earns the trust that it asks for. We deserve better, guys, and the only way that we get it is if we demand it.